Dean Baker, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, discusses the growth and what he calls the predictable collapse of the housing and stock market bubbles. Mr. Baker is critical of both the Reagan and Clinton administrations, and he offers suggestions for preventing additional financial crises. The event, hosted by busboys and poets in Washington, D.C., is an hour.
Thanks. I sort of feel like I should have a guitar here. I have to say, when it was snowing, I was thinking, wow, that's great, because now I have a really good excuse if only 4 people show up. So somehow you came out anyhow. I guess that's what a good economic crash will do. What I want to do is, I won't talk that long because I won't have a lot of time for questions, but what I want to do is start quickly. First off, give sort of the basic story as what I see as the origins of the bubble economy. Then say a little bit about the stock bubble. I like to be bipartisan here, so I get to trash both Clinton and Bush here. So I'll say a little bit about the stock bubble, and then the housing bubble, and then obviously a little bit about the collapse and what I see as some of the key issues going forward, including the stimulus bill that hopefully the House will pass tomorrow. Okay, well, starting out, the transition, how do we get to a bubble economy? I think it is really important for people to understand that we didn't always have bubble economies. I mean, obviously we had 2 very big, very dangerous bubbles in the last decade or so. But if you look to the post-war period, we had 30 years or so after World War II in which the economy had very healthy growth and really didn't have any significant bubbles to speak of. It didn't have significant financial bubbles. That doesn't mean there were never prices that were out of line. But you'd be very hard-pressed if you look through the economy in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and into the 70s to find any sort of very erratic movements in asset prices that really disrupted the economy. And to my mind, that was the sort of economy we'd like to see, that you had a situation where you had very good economic growth, the economy was growing rapidly, productivity was growing rapidly, but it was broadly shared, so that across the board, up and down the income ladder, you saw rising real incomes. Typical workers were seeing their wages rise more or less in step with productivity growth. And I'd argue that that's not an economy that's conducive to bubbles. That, of course, changed as we got into the 70s, and then most importantly by deliberate policy changes with President Reagan coming into office in 1980. Basically, President Reagan adopted a set of policies that were quite deliberately designed to weaken the power of workers, weaken the power of unions, and to redistribute income upwards. And it certainly had that effect. So many of these policies, these are things we're all familiar with. Certainly the weakening of unions. President Reagan quite deliberately tried to weaken the power of organized labor. He appointed people in the National Labor Relations Board that were much more hostile to unions. It made it much more difficult to organize. Everyone remembers the air traffic controllers. He fired the air traffic controllers when they went on strike. They really changed the norms of labor management relations, because prior to the firing of the air traffic controllers, employers did not fire striking workers. It simply, unless you're a renegade, it wasn't acceptable practice. The idea was that if you had a strike, you negotiated with your workers, you maybe operated with a skeletal staff, you kept some management personnel, but the deal was, could you outlast your workers? Your workers weren't getting a paycheck, you weren't selling anything. That was the deal. That was the context in which negotiations took place. Immediately after President Reagan fired the air traffic controllers, there were a whole set of instances in which major companies, Eastern Airlines was one, Greyhound Bus Company, where they fired their workers when they went out on strike. Totally changed the dynamics of labor relations. Going out on strike meant you could lose your job. It obviously made it a much more effective a much less effective weapon for workers, for unions against employers. Well, that was part of a larger set of changes that the Reagan administration put in place that weakened the power of labor. It wasn't just the unions. Trade policy. We had a trade policy that was quite explicitly designed to put our manufacturing workers in direct competition with low-wage, low-paid workers in the developing world. And the predicted effect of that, the predicted and actual effect of that, is that it drives down the wages of manufacturing workers in the United States. And in fact, because manufacturing at the time certainly was the major place of employment of good-paying jobs for workers without college degrees, that had the effect of driving down the wages of workers without college degrees more generally. Also deregulation of major sectors like trucking, like the airline industry. That also had the effect of weakening the power of workers in those industries. Those were places where workers, non-college educated workers, had relatively good-paying jobs. The high dollar. We had a high dollar in the 80s. I'll come back to this. We had a high dollar in the middle of the 80s. That led to a large trade deficit. Again, that impeded the competitiveness of our manufacturing industry, put more downward pressure on the wages of manufacturing workers. So we had a variety of policies that weakened the power of working people in the country, and what it meant was that workers no longer were in a position to share in the gains of productivity growth. So this created the environment, or so I would argue, it created the environment in which you could have a bubble economy. Prior to the Reagan era, you had a situation of this virtuous cycle where you had productivity growth translate into wage growth, translate into consumption, increased demand, increased investment, increased productivity growth, wages, etc. You broke that cycle when wages no longer kept pace with productivity growth, and you created an environment in which bubbles could grow. Okay, so when did we first start seeing the bubbles? Well, we didn't see any significant bubbles in the 80s. The bubbles first became an issue in the 90s with the Clinton administration. And I would argue that President Clinton pursued a policy, his central tenets of his macroeconomic policy, which was very conducive to a growth of a bubble, both his focus on deficit reduction and also his deregulation, or I call it one-sided deregulation of the financial sector. I'll come to the one-sided in a minute. The central tenet of President Clinton's economic policy was deficit reduction. We have to get deficits down. And many of you may recall when he first came into office, he sort of was torn. We'll see how President Obama deals with this tension very shortly, I imagine. But he was torn between all these commitments he had made towards investing in people, putting people first, if you remember his platform. On the other hand, all the deficit hawks, led by Robert Rubin, who became his Treasury Secretary, of course, saying, no, we have to get the deficits down. That's what really has to be front and center. And of course, the deficit hawks were the ones that won out. He largely abandoned his public investment program, the idea of putting a lot of money into education, infrastructure, research and development. That was largely abandoned in favor of the deficit reduction side of the story. So what was that supposed to do? Well, the deficit reduction story was we get the deficit down, lowers interest rates, we're supposed to increase investment. And the increase in investment is supposed to make up for the lost demand. If we're reducing the deficit, that means we're either raising taxes, which of course President Clinton did, and or cutting spending. He also cut spending. He did do both. Okay, so that's reducing demand. You make that up with increased investment. So that was sort of the classic story of what was supposed to happen. Okay, well, part of that did happen. We did get very low interest rates. So if you look back to the 90s, we did get very low interest rates. We did get some uptick in investment. But the real part of that story, what really happened and led the economy, the economic growth, which we actually obviously did have very good economic growth towards the end of the 90s, what really led that was the stock bubble. So we had a very low interest rate environment. That was one that was very conducive for the growth of the stock bubble. And we saw that stock prices hit levels, ratios to corporate earnings that we'd never seen before, at least not since the 20s. I'm not expert enough on what the 20s looked like, so I couldn't tell you price-to-earnings ratios then. But historically, the price-to-earnings ratio in the stock market had been around 14 to 1, 14 to 15 to 1. So stock prices were equal to roughly 14 times corporate profits. In the late 90s, that rose over 20 to 1 by 95. And by the end of the decade, it had crossed 30 to 1. Okay, this should have been easy to recognize as a bubble, by the way. It didn't take a great genius. A lot of people were surprised. They lost a lot of money. They probably deserved it, at least many of them. But it should have been easy to recognize when you saw price-to-earnings ratios that got to these ridiculous levels in the late 90s. I'm saying this remembering that I had to argue with a lot of people because there were a lot of people who thought it was a great idea to put Social Security money in the stock market back then. They just said, we'll just put it there and we'll all be rich. You know, but it should have been easy to recognize that you had a stock bubble in the late 90s, but for the most part, certainly the folks, the policy people here in Washington, for the most part, didn't recognize that, and they continued to act like, oh, everything's just fine with the stock market. And for the time, through the late 90s, that was actually what drove the economy. So if you look at what were the sources of growth in the late 90s, there was a little bit of an increase in investment. So you actually had reasonably good investment. That story is exaggerated because a lot of the Clintonites will like to say, oh, investment soared. That's not true, and I could tell you more carefully about why that's not true. But there was some uptick in investment. Some of that was directly related to the stock bubble. So it was one of these rare occasions where stock prices actually led to investment because you had the classic story of companies selling stock the internet companies selling stock and using that to finance investment. That's not usually something that happens. That did happen a little bit in the late 90s. But what really fueled the economy, the strong growth that we saw in the late 90s, was consumption based on stock wealth. There's a well-known wealth effect that economists have written about God knows how long that relates consumption to stock wealth on the order of about 3 or 4 cents on the dollar. And by my calculations, we had roughly $10 trillion of bubble wealth in the stock market at the peak of the bubble, which translated at 3 or 4 cents on the dollar into 300 or 400 billion a year in additional consumption, or measured relative to GDP. That was 3 to 4% of GDP. That's a lot of money. Today, that would be the equivalent of about 450 billion to 600 billion a year of additional consumption. And that fits the data very well. You see savings rates fall very low. They fell to about 2% at the end of the decade. So the basic story was that in the late 90s, we did have this very good growth. It wasn't the story that the Clinton people like to tell. It wasn't really investment-led. It was led by the stock bubble. And that promoted consumption, and it got the unemployment rate down to 4%. I think all of us were very happy to see that. There were, at that point, good wage gains for workers up and down the income ladder. But the real problem with this story was that it wasn't sustainable, because there was a bubble, it couldn't last, and eventually it burst. The story why it burst was you eventually ran out of people who were willing to pay hundreds of millions of dollars for dot garbage, and, you know, prices fell. So you got to 2000, March of 2000, and NASDAQ hit 5,000. By the summer it was down to 3,000, and by the next summer it was down to about 1,100. When it started to plunge, I remember I had a friend, it had fallen to, as I said, it had fallen to about 3,200 that summer. And I remember I came across a friend who I think probably had a lot of money in the NASDAQ, but he didn't want to tell me that. But I made some comment about the stock market falling further, and he said, well, not the NASDAQ. And I said, no, it could fall further. And he said, well, how low do you think it can go? You know, it's already gone from 5,000 to 3,200. And I said, I don't know, you know, it could go to 1,600, you know. I literally was just picking a number out of the air. And then about a year later, it went to 1,600. I was trying to decide whether I should call him or not to tell him that wasn't a buy recommendation. As I say, it eventually did bottom out. I think it was around 1,100 in the summer of 2002. But in any case, that wasn't sustainable, and of course that collapsed. So it was, we had 4 good years, 96 to 2000, unemployment was down, wages were growing. A lot of good things you could say about the economy during those periods, but it clearly wasn't a sustainable story. Now, another part of the story that was very important, and I think I and many other people overlooked at the time the full importance of it, we had the strong dollar policy. And this again, it's something that's very perverse. I had this argument with all these economists because we learned one thing when we were in grad school, and now they say something completely on the other side. No one ever acknowledges, like, aren't you saying the opposite of what you taught us? You know, I mean, I used to have this thing that I had to argue with mainstream economists. Now I realize I don't have to argue. I just have to write down what they said and repeat it back to them. But anyhow, the story that we were all taught in grad school, and in fact all economists would have said until the mid-90s when it sort of flipped on us, was that when you got the deficit down, part of the good things that were supposed to happen was you had lower interest rates, the dollar was supposed to fall. Why is that good? Well, when the dollar falls, our exports become cheaper, so people buy more of them, we export more, and imports become more expensive to people living in the United States, so we'll import less. That's supposed to get rid of the trade deficit. And there's whole literature, totally mainstream, center of the discipline literature that talked about the twin deficits. We had a high trade deficit in the 80s, beginning of the 90s, because we had a high budget deficit. So they said, we'll get the budget deficit down, you'll get interest rates down, get the dollar down, and then we'll improve our trade balance. So getting the budget deficit down was supposed to get the dollar down. Okay, well, they flipped that around in the late 90s, and no one ever bothered to tell us that. Suddenly, getting the deficit down got the dollar up. Made no sense, but everyone repeated that. So you had Robert Rubin running around, strong dollar. We got the deficit down, therefore we have a strong dollar. It's total nonsense. But in any case, that was the official line. The reality was that the reason the dollar went up in the late 90s was in part also a result of conscious policy, the way we dealt with the East Asian financial crisis. The United States, which obviously directs the IMF, took a very big hand in dealing with the East Asian financial crisis in '97. We imposed very harsh conditions on these countries, basically saying you have to pay back your debts. And the way they were able to pay back their debts was they had to export like crazy. And how do you export like crazy if you're South Korea, Thailand, Malaysia, pick these countries? You devalue your currency. So the flip side of them having a low currency, we had a high currency. They exported like crazy to us. We ran very large trade deficits. And that continued through the end of the decade into this decade, so we had a trade deficit that ultimately peaked at about 6% of our economy in 2006. Again, in today's dollars, that would be about $900 billion. So we had a huge trade deficit. It was caused by the high dollar. That was the cause of the trade deficit. Okay, so my reason for mentioning that is, okay, so we get the crash of the stock bubble. The economy goes into a recession in 2001, March of 2001. Officially, if you talk to economists, they say, oh, that was a real mild recession. You know, it lasted just from March of 2001 to November of 2001, just 7 months, about as short as a recession could be. And, you know, they say it was a very mild recession. What's the big deal? Well, the reality, of course, was it wasn't a mild recession. I mean, we could date the recessions wherever we want. That's arbitrary. But the point is, what happened in 2001 is we lost jobs. We continued to lose jobs long after the recession ended. So it officially ends in November of 2001. We continued to shed jobs all through 2002. We didn't actually start creating jobs again until the fall of 2003. So it was a very long period we went without creating any jobs. Now, part of that story was the high dollar policy. Typically what happens in a recession is you expect to see improvement on your trade balance. You expect to import less. You often will export more. We didn't see that. Our trade deficit kept growing. That was a high dollar problem. We didn't do anything about that. A lot of people seem to think that was good policy. Okay, well, what was the other part of the story? How do you get the economy going? Well, Greenspan's sitting there going, well, the economy's dead in the water. It's not creating jobs. What do? You lower interest rates. He was right to do that. It was a very weak economy. There wasn't much else he could do. Okay, well, what else did he do? Well, the only real source of life in the economy at that point was the housing bubble. And what I would say, and I don't have personal contact with Greenspan, but what I would say is he deliberately fostered the growth of the housing bubble. He did a lot of things at different points that would seem to indicate he wanted the housing bubble to grow. First and foremost, what he did was he denied that there was a bubble. I first began to look at the housing market. I mean, I follow the housing market. I'm a macroeconomist. I follow the housing market like I follow the energy market or the auto industry. That's typically how I follow the housing market. I first began to look at the housing market very closely because in the summer of 2002, Greenspan was giving testimony before Congress, and he made a big point of saying how there is no housing bubble. And I read his testimony, and I looked at the reasons he gave, and none of them made any sense. Okay, so he said, well, why are house prices, because at that point you could always see house prices had vastly outstripped the rate of growth of inflation. So prior to house prices began to rise in the mid-90s, interestingly corresponding with the stock bubble, but prior to the mid-90s, you can go back 100 years, house prices had just kept even with the overall rate of inflation. That's a national average, because I know you could all tell me about California, New York, or this place or that place, but as a national average, house prices had just risen at the same rate as the price of other goods and services. So car prices, clothes, the average of other goods and services, they'd risen at the same rate. That changes in the mid-90s. They suddenly begin to rise much more rapidly than other prices, and by 2002, they'd risen by about 30% after you adjust for inflation from their mid-90s level. So Greenspan goes before Congress and he goes, well, we don't have a housing bubble. The reason why that's happening, he goes, well, on the demand side, it's because we've had rapid growth in income. Now you go, then that makes sense. We did have good growth, obviously, in the late 90s, but by the time he's talking, we've already been in the recession. Income had stopped growing. That really didn't make much sense. Furthermore, the income growth we had in the late 90s wasn't that good. It wasn't any better than the income growth we had for a quarter century at the end of World War II, and that didn't produce any bubble. So there was no real story there, income growth. The other thing he said I really loved, this again speaks to the way economists work, he said, well, the other thing that's driving it up on the demand side is population growth, which the reason why I found that so incredible, because one of the other areas that I'm arguing with people is Social Security. And you recall the problem with Social Security is population's not growing. So over here, Alan Greenspan's talking about population growth causing up a big rise in house prices. Over here, he's with all the other people saying, oh my God, we have this horrible problem with Social Security. You know, our population's not growing. You know, we'll give you one or other. You don't get both. So that didn't make any sense. He also said immigrants. He blamed on immigrants. He goes, well, I don't think immigrants are buying $450,000 homes over in California. And it really didn't make a lot of sense. So that was the demand side of the story. His supply side, he goes, well, we have a fixed amount of buildable land in our cities. And you go, yeah, that's not exactly new. Furthermore, again, I sort of like, you get one argument over here and the opposite over there. We've just been through the new economy where limitations of time and space didn't matter anymore. Now that, of course, was to a large extent nonsense, but it's not total nonsense in the sense that it's possible to telecommute in a way today that wasn't true certainly 15 or 20 years ago. So there are limitations of space. There's only so many people who could live in downtown D.C. or whatever, but those limitations were probably less binding in the Internet age than they were 10 or 15 years earlier. So that wasn't a real good story. The other thing he talked about was environmental restrictions on building. And again, you just sort of go, well, the timing here isn't quite right. I mean, the Republicans had taken over Congress in 1994. They weren't big environmentalists for the most part. They'd taken over many state houses. So if we wanted to tell a story that environmental restrictions on building were limiting the supply of housing, this probably wasn't the time that would be true. And if we really wanted to check on that, well, why don't we just look at how many homes we're building? And that was easy enough to do. And you could find that we're building homes at near record rate. And that was all through this period, 2002 through 2006. So he didn't have a story on the supply side, didn't have a story on the demand side. The last part of the story, if you want to check here, is you just go, well, what's going on with rents? Because at the end of the day, there is, to some extent, one housing market. I mean, we know most people would rather buy than rent, but if those prices get radically out of line, you get people move into a city, they're going to make a decision to rent, or people forming their own household for the first time, moving away from their parents. If they're hugely out of line, they're going to decide to rent rather than buy. So we'd expect that those prices to more or less move together. And if you look at what was going on with rents, the answer was nothing. They rose a little bit more than the rate of inflation through the late 90s, but by 2001, 2002, they'd flattened out, and actually through most of this period, rents actually weren't even keeping pace with rate of inflation. So in short, there was no story based on the fundamentals. It was pretty clear that you had a bubble, and you had Alan Greenspan deliberately going out of his way to deny it. Okay, so he did a couple other things along the way that I would argue fostered the bubble. Some of you might recall that in the fall of 2003, when interest rates, fixed interest rates, a 30-year mortgage, was at that time near a 50-year low. We've since gotten lower, but at that time it was near its 50-year low. He encouraged people to take out adjustable rate mortgages. Okay, so that was the sort of thing, you know, again, not everyone listens to Alan Greenspan directly in deciding what sort of mortgage to take out, but obviously his words get passed on so that you have, if you didn't directly hear Alan Greenspan, maybe your friend did, maybe your realtor did, maybe your mortgage broker did, that was a green light to people to take out adjustable rate mortgages, which was a very peculiar practice given that you can get a record low rate on fixed rate mortgages. Okay, so I could give you a few other things as to why I think he was fostering the bubble, but long and short, he certainly did nothing to rein in its growth. And on top of that, we had this whole pattern of financial, as I say, one-sided deregulation dating from the Clinton era, and certainly Greenspan continued that, where they let incredible abuses, incredibly risky practices take place in the financial sector. And my reason for preferring the term one-sided deregulation rather than just saying deregulation is I think it's important to not give these people the benefit of the doubt, or more than the benefit of the doubt, not let them be dishonest about their views, because they always were benefiting from government insurance in the form of the too big to fail doctrine. And what that meant was when all these guys were going out there saying, oh, we don't want the government, just give us a free hand, you know, really smart people, we run Citigroup, we run Goldman Sachs, we don't need the government to tell us what to do. Well, at the end of the day, they knew that the government was going to come in and bail them out, or at least bail their creditors out, and their creditors knew that. Basically what they had was an insurance policy that they didn't want to pay for. It gives them way too much credit to call them market fundamentalists. That gives them way too much credit. They're not market fundamentalists. I like to call them nanny state conservatives. They wanted the government to give them a very valuable insurance policy. They didn't want to have to pay for it. Okay, that's how we should understand these people. Okay, well, anyhow, obviously what goes on through this period, house prices go through the roof. They eventually rise by almost 80% when you adjust for inflation. In many of the bubble markets, to some extent D.C. and the East Coast, but the biggest bubble markets are places like Las Vegas, California, Florida. Prices more than doubled after adjusting for inflation. This is where you saw the worst activity in terms of people getting adjustable rate mortgages that there was no way on earth they could afford. In many cases, interest-only loans, buying homes, putting zero money down. Okay, we had a whole set of practices that just should jump out at anyone, that this was not sustainable, this was going to end very badly. Greenspan, my favorite villain here, one of the remarkable things, anyone who's paying attention to this should have known, subprime mortgages exploded as a share of the market. They'd been around, I don't know when you first had something that was identifiable as subprime, but they'd been around a long time, 7, 8, 9% of the market. They explode to be 25% of the market in 2005. Now, Greenspan this summer was quoted in the Washington Post as saying, well, he just discovered that. His last month, in January 2006, he said he saw a very disturbing statistics. He saw that subprime were 25% of the market, and he was very disturbed by that. And then, at least he told the Post, he said he couldn't remember whether he passed this information on to Ben Bernanke. Now, again, I don't know which is worse, that Greenspan is lying about this, or if that's actually true. I mean, that's a tough one. I don't know. But long and short, I mean, these were the sorts of practices that it should have been evident to anyone whose business it was to follow the economy that we had a very serious bubble here and it was going to end very badly. Well, how does it end? How do all bubbles end? Well, just as with the stock bubble, you run out of suckers. Okay, house prices kept going up. We kept building more houses. Okay, vacancy rates were rising. This is all, it's amazing. The Commerce Department, Census Bureau, puts out vacancy rates every quarter. I think I was like the only person in the country who ever paid attention to them because I talk about it. I talk to the reporters. I go, "Where'd you get that?" It's right on their website. It's not secret data. So vacancy rates were soaring. Well, what does that mean? Again, you don't have to be some sort of crazy radical economist. You have a big increase in supply. It exceeds demand. You have a lot of excess houses sitting there vacant. What's that going to do to the price? I mean, that isn't that hard. But it was a big surprise to the boys on Wall Street at Goldman Sachs, Citibank, and everyone else. Suddenly, price started falling. Home prices were resetting. Mortgages were resetting. And what you had when the mortgages reset, this was a twofold problem. The center part of the problem was that the house price had fallen. It's remarkable to me how many economists still don't understand that. Center part of the problem was that house price had fallen. The other part is that people could no longer afford their monthly payments. My reason for saying the central part of the problem is that house prices had fallen. If house prices had kept rising, who cares? So your mortgage reset, you'd had a 5% mortgage, it goes up to 9%, and you had a 6%, goes to 10%. Well, if your house price is going up by 20%, you just run down to the bank and get a new mortgage. And that's what a lot of people had been doing. And as long as your house price keeps going up, that's fine. You can keep doing that forever. The problem is when instead of going up 20%, your house price goes down 20%. So you borrowed $250,000 on a home that today is worth $200,000. That was the problem. That was the underlying problem. House prices fell. Okay, and obviously this cascaded. So once you had a situation where house prices started falling, people began to expect them to fall. You saw higher default rates, higher foreclosure rates. Well, welcome to 2009. Okay, so we get this downward spiral, everything goes in reverse. Instead of construction driving up the economy, at its peak, construction is about 6% of GDP, residential construction. It collapses. It's now 3% of GDP. We're building homes at less than half the rate that we were just 2 years ago, just 3 years ago. So residential construction collapses. That's a huge hit to the economy. But then the more serious hit is that as house prices collapse, all the money that people thought they had in their home, all their equity, just disappeared. Okay, by my calculations, at the peak of the bubble in 2006, we had close to $8 trillion in housing bubble wealth. That's the difference between prices as they were in 2006 and prices where they would have been if they just followed their trend level. $8 trillion translates into $110,000 for every homeowner in the country. That's disappearing now. We've lost roughly 3/4 of that. We've lost roughly $6 trillion in housing bubble wealth. So what does that mean? A lot of people that thought they had $200,000 equity in their home, they might have $50,000. You have more than 10 million people are now underwater in their homes. They owe more in the value of their home. So apart from the people that are losing their home through foreclosure because they can't make the mortgage payments, the population as a whole has seen trillions of dollars of wealth disappear, and as a result of that, they're consuming a lot less, in some cases because they have no option. You can't, if you have no equity in your home, you can't borrow against it to take a vacation, buy a car, or in some cases just pay your living expenses. You can't do that if you don't have any equity to borrow against. In other cases, they're realizing you have people, we have this huge baby boom cohort that is close to retirement, and a lot of them are realizing they don't have any money. They also saw, of course, the collapse of the stock market cut the value of their 401ks by 30 or 40%. So now they realize they don't have long-term retirement. They have to get very serious about saving. So there's not a great mystery as to why you get into a downturn when you see a collapse of the housing market destroy $6 trillion in wealth, coupled, again, we could talk about the stock market losing on the order of $7 or $8 trillion in wealth. Now, add to all this, we get our nice financial crisis to throw in. Again, it's not a surprise you get a financial crisis when you get a collapse of a housing bubble. Housing's always a highly leveraged asset. I mean, even go back to the good old days, we were all buying homes putting 20% down. Well, that went to 0 down in a lot of cases in 2003, 2004, 2005. I remember a survey of the realtors, 42% of first-time homebuyers in 2005 put 0 down. Pretty incredible statistic. Again, if Alan Greenspan were awake, he would have noticed that. So in any case, it's not a surprise that you get a financial crisis because you have a very heavily leveraged asset that's just lost much of its value. So all these banks are sitting there with mortgages that are worth a fraction of what they were when they issued them. And obviously the fact that they were issuing them in complex instruments, collateralized debt obligations, we had all sorts of financial mechanics being put in place by our friends on Wall Street, that made them that much more vulnerable to this sort of downturn. By the way, I always find it amusing where they keep saying, no one could have envisioned this. Robert Rubin was quoted as saying that. No one could have envisioned this. It is incredible that you could have someone, I don't hate to pick on Robert Rubin. I like to pick on Robert Rubin. That someone, he made $120 million at Citibank, and he said he had nothing to do with any of this. You sort of wonder what he was getting paid for. But when you say no one could have envisioned this, I just can't imagine that you really had people sitting at Citibank and not one of them looked at this and thought there could be a problem here. I mean, it really is mind-boggling. It is a little mind-boggling. So anyhow, that aside, so where are we now? So we've seen a collapse of the housing market, collapse of consumption, and the economy is essentially in a free fall. I mean, this is really, it's very scary. I mean, the amount of job loss that we had over the last 3 months, the last quarter of 2008, we lost more than 500,000 jobs a month. This is almost unprecedented. And what scares me is that I think it's actually accelerating. So all of you probably heard the layoffs yesterday. Caterpillar announced 20,000. Intel announced, I think it was 6,000. And it's really across sectors. The pharmaceutical industry, Pfizer, I think said 8,000. So it's, retail, Circuit City just shut down. That was 33,000 jobs. So as bad as the job loss was through the fall, it looks like it might even be more rapid in January and presumably February. I mean, I don't say anything to sort of turn the picture around very soon, which is why Congress better pass that stimulus package very quickly, because we really do need that to turn the economy around. So I was on a show last night with opposite some guy from the Heritage Foundation, and I made some comment about the key with stimulus is you have to spend money, and I saw that they put up on their website, go, now we have those liberals, there he is, he just said it, And I'll say it again if they want it, we're on C-SPAN so they could, get it again. You have to spend money. That may sound stupid, but that's the key to get out of this sort of downturn. Now, obviously, it's better to spend money on things that are good, that will help people today, make us more productive in the future. If we could build infrastructure, it'll make us more productive. If we could retrofit our homes so that they use less energy, all of that is great. But first and foremost, the key right now is we've got to spend money. We're spiraling downward, and it makes much more sense to spend money on things that might not be the best thing in the world than sit there going, well, maybe we could spend over here. We'll take listening to Republicans, I think they want to spend the next year figuring out where we spend the money. In the meantime, we're going to lose another 5 million jobs. So that's a little wacky. So, I mean, that's the short-term story. The problem with the Obama plan is I think it's not big enough, but I mean, I'd still say this is a start. Get it out there. We're going to have to do more. But that's a very, very good start. Now, just very quickly, over the longer term, what we have to do is talk about having a very different type of economy. We have to talk about getting back to the sort of economy we had in the post-war period where people could share, where everyone shares in the gains of economic and productivity growth. I won't give you all the recipes for that. I have them in another book. No, I won't give you all the recipes. But the one thing I will say is we have to contain the financial sector. I mean, we have to treat the financial sector, I'll be crude here, I'd say I treat them like a cancer. I mean, we do not want a big financial sector. And again, this is again just common sense, and economists on the days they're being honest will agree with this. The financial sector is an intermediate good. It's like trucking. Imagine we had a trucking industry where it employed 10% of our labor force. We had 14 million people employed in trucking. Well, any person in their right mind, the actual number is about 1.4 million, about 1%. Any person in their right mind would go, well, you really have a bloated trucking sector. It's really inefficient. And they'd be right. Why would you want 10% of your workforce moving goods around when we could do it with 1%? Well, it's the same thing with finance. Finance is supposed to be there to serve the productive economy. It's supposed to be there so that when we want to get a mortgage, we want to borrow money to start a business or expand a business, we want to save money for our kids' education, for our retirement, that's why we have finance. It's not an end in itself. It's not like health care or recreation. It's not something we're going to feel better because we have more finance. That's crazy. So we had this explosion in this sector over the last 30 years that really was in effect a parasite on the rest of the economy. It was draining resources from the rest of the economy and ultimately jeopardized the rest of the economy and led to the economic disaster we're seeing. So I think the policies we put in place should be deliberately designed to rein in the financial sector. One of the things I've been very fond of is just a very modest financial transactions tax. If you taxed stock trades, say about 0.25 of 1%, no one's going to like paying that, I know that. But the reality of the matter is that for people who are buying stock to hold for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, that's a really inconsequential fee. We used to pay more when you bought stock 20, 30 years ago because transaction costs were higher then. It's a really inconsequential fee. On the other hand, for people who are buying stock at 1 o'clock and selling it at 2, that's a very big fee. Okay, so it would discourage a lot of speculation. It would keep the financial sector from growing as big as it's gotten. And I say that's really important for a couple reasons. One, I love the idea of getting revenue that way, and by my estimates, I did a paper with my friend Bob Poland a few years ago. We estimate you can get over $100 billion a year from a tax like that. That's real money. Okay, so you get a lot of money that way. You keep the sector's size down, and I'd say that's important, not just because you make it more efficient, but at the end of the day, what was really key in our failure to regulate the sector wasn't that you didn't have people who knew what was going on, because at different points you did. So, for example, Brooksley Barn, who was head of the Commodity Future Trading Commission in '98, wanted to rein in. She wanted to regulate derivatives. She wanted to regulate credit default swaps. It would have been a great thing if she had done that. She wasn't able to do that because you had people like Robert Rubin who came down on her like a ton of bricks and said, no, you can't do that. Okay, and Robert Rubin had the political clout, she didn't. So she was overruled. In this decade, Ned Gramlich, who was one of the members of the Board of Governors, unfortunately passed on last year, but he went to Greenspan. He saw what was going on. He said, you know, we have this real problem. We have all these low-income people who are buying these complex subprime mortgages. They don't understand that. We could regulate that. Greenspan waved him away and said, I'm not interested. There were a few other instances like that where you had people who wanted to do the right thing, but they weren't able to because the people with political power prevented them from doing that. And my takeaway from that is that one of the problems is the financial sector has too much political power, and it's going to have too much political power if we let it get to be a big, powerful industry. So that's another argument, I think a very important argument for reining it in, because we could write all the best rules in the world, and you've got all these people running around town. I don't know how many conferences I've been in the last 6 months about writing the new rules, and we need good rules. But you also need them enforced. And if you don't have a political situation that allows you to effectively enforce the rules don't matter. So that's another reason why I think it's very important to rein in the financial sector. They're going to have their one-sided insurance policy no matter what. I don't see a way we can get around too big to fail. So we have to make sure that they pay a price for it. They don't get it for free, which means we need serious regulation, and that, to my mind, means we have a small financial sector. So just in conclusion, I want to say that, you know, we have an incredible amount of opportunities, and I don't think I made any disparaging remarks about Obama, because I'm very happy to see him in the White House. I think we have incredible opportunities here, and I really hope we're in a position to take advantage of them, and we do take advantage of them to the fullest. And, you know, I'll steal a line from his Chief of Staff, Rahm Emanuel, you should never waste a crisis. So let's not waste it. Thanks. Okay, so I'll take questions. I guess there's just one mic there.
Hi, I enjoyed your talk. Could you please tell me what you think about the new Treasury Secretary?
Wish he had paid his taxes. I have some concerns about the new Treasury Secretary, Tim Geithner, for people not familiar. He played a central role in the Clinton administration in engineering the East Asian financial bailout. He was at the New York Fed as much of this was going on. Basically, he missed the story, and I'm not sure his conduct, even after things start to fall apart, was too much better. And this is one of these things I find very perverse. If you look at someone's track record, because people have asked me about Larry Summers, who of course is the head of President Obama's National Economic Council, and you know, Summers is a very bright guy. He's written a lot of good economics pieces, but the fact was he was in the center of the Clinton administration. He supported the policies that got us here. And if you raise that point, well, let's look at their track record. People are looking at you like, why would you be so vindictive? I mean, it seems like a reasonable thing to do. And I say that for a very important reason, that one of the problems here is that you have a totally asymmetric structure of incentives. I mean, I don't think I was uniquely brilliant in being able to see the bubble. The issue was I wasn't sort of in the same hierarchies as Tim Geithner and these other people were. And from their vantage point, if they had done what I did, if Tim Geithner 3 years ago had gotten out and said, God, we have a really big bubble, this is really bad, it's going to cause lots of problems, he would have had Greenspan and all these other people go, Tim, you're nuts. You know, you want to lose your job? You know, he had to worry about that. So he had a very asymmetric set of incentives that suppose he saw exactly what I did, he thought exactly the way I did, well, he'd go, well, I could do what Baker's doing, but I'm really going to run into trouble, particularly if I'm wrong, because none of us could be absolutely certain we're right. On the other hand, if I just go, oh, everything's okay, everything's great, there's no housing bubble, everything's fine, well, he was really wrong, but does anyone hold it against him? No, he's Treasury Secretary. So if you don't do anything about that structure of incentives, you have this totally one-sided pressure where everyone's just going to say what their boss says, what the higher-ups say, everything's fine. Why would you ever do otherwise? So Geithner may be a very bright guy, but we're not going to get the benefit of his wisdom if he's just doing what the person on top of him says. And that's true for all these economists, all these people in policy positions. So I wasn't happy to see him picked as Treasury Secretary.
Thank you.
I'm not sure if it was mentioned in the introduction. I just want to make sure that people know about Dean's blog. It's a great resource and a great way to be learning about things contemporaneously. I guess if you just Google Dean Baker, it'll be the first thing that pops up.
Beat the Press on the American Prospects website.
I'd love to get your analysis of TARP and where we go from here. I mean, what was your analysis of the giveaway, if that was necessary? I felt a little weird the last several months. There have been all these progressive economists, not just you, but a lot of progressive economists whose main mission seems to be to save the capitalist structure. And I understand that because we don't want a lot of people hurt, but there is a sort of eerie feel to the whole thing. Yeah. So TARP and where we go from here regarding.
Okay. Well, I actually was an opponent of the TARP bill. It was actually a fascinating story, having been to some extent in the middle. I don't know if I was that much in the middle of it, but I was talking to a number of members of Congress and their staffers as I was being debated. And I felt a couple things. First off, it was being very much misrepresented to the public. There was this real effort to create a greater sense of crisis than there was. Now, the financial system was in very bad shape at that point. I wouldn't deny that for a second. Was it on the edge of collapse? Did we actually have to pass the TARP that day? Well, I think not. I think Henry Paulson proved that because he didn't do anything with the money for 10 days after he had full legal authority to do whatever he wanted with it. So obviously he didn't think it was that urgent. But we did have this effort to say there was this great urgency, and it was striking. I mean, one of the issues that was fascinating to me was the claim that if we didn't, to my mind, the immediate urgency, if there was a case we had to do something that day, it wasn't that the banks weren't lending to each other. That was a problem. But what really was threatening was if you got to a situation where companies could not do business. So the story was you had an otherwise healthy company, a Verizon, that fine profits. I mean, I'm not going to do a plug for Verizon, but it's not about to go out of business. And they couldn't borrow the money in the commercial paper market to meet their payroll, pay their bills. Now, if that happens, the economy shuts down. So the argument was that was happening. I think that was overplayed. There was some evidence something like that was happening. Well, after the TARP was passed, that weekend, Ben Bernanke, the Federal Reserve Board chairman, announced that he was going to buy up commercial paper of non-financial companies. Well, why is that important? Well, it's important for two reasons. One, if he could buy up the paper of non-financial companies, we don't have to worry about Verizon not having the money to meet their payroll. The other reason why it was so striking, at least to me, was I didn't know the Fed had that authority. And if the Fed had that authority, you had to ask, or at least I asked, why didn't you do that before Congress voted? The Fed is not supposed to be in the business of manipulating congressional votes. And I think they did that. Now, they weren't the only ones. The media, and this is almost across the board, I never saw the media come down with such uniformity on an issue where if you were against the TARP, you were basically a knuckle-scraping Neanderthal, which was really striking because a lot of very prominent economists were against the TARP. It wasn't just me and a few kind of crazy fringe lefties. There was a letter that came out from the University of Chicago that was signed by hundreds of economists, many of them very prominent economists, saying we don't have to do this. It's not urgent. This isn't well thought through. This isn't the way to do it. So, but nonetheless, the media was portraying it that if you didn't support the TARP, you were knuckle-scraping Neanderthal. And at the end of the day, they literally made it impossible for members of Congress to vote against it. And again, I say this from having talked with them, because they created this situation. Remember when it went down the first time, the market fell by about 10% that day. The Dow fell about 1,000 points. They immediately rushed out and said, you just destroyed $1 trillion of wealth. It was like an idiot thing to say, but that's what they were saying. I could go on about why there's an idiot thing to say. So the members of Congress who voted against it just destroyed $1 trillion of wealth. Well, they created this situation where it was very clear that the people, if the TARP went down, the people voted against it were going to be blamed for every bad thing that happened in the economy. And I could guarantee them, as everyone else could, lots of bad things were going to happen in the economy. So the question was, did you want to be blamed for them? Because if you voted for the TARP and bad things happened, well, guess what? Really bad things have happened. I haven't heard anyone blame for it. Has anyone heard a member of Congress blame for that? You idiot, you voted for the TARP, look what happened. I haven't seen anyone blame for that. So they created a situation where members of Congress had the option, you could either vote for the TARP and you're fine, you don't have to worry about a thing, or you could vote against it, and if it goes down, you're going to be blamed for every bad thing that happens. Well, no member in the right mind, they obviously care about being reelected. I mean, not to say they don't care about something else, but if they don't get reelected, they don't have a job, they care about being elected. That meant they voted for the TARP. That meant there was no way it was going to go down at the end of the day. Let's see, the other part of your question, I just, looking at the options, yeah, I just say that I don't see an option to try and save this system. I don't, there's not another one out there that I see. If I saw another one out there, I might talk about it, but I don't see another one. So in terms of the best thing progressives could do, yeah, I think trying to save this system and make it work for people as best we can is the best thing we could do.
Thank you. A comment you made disturbed me a little bit. You said that people were, the Republicans were joking or teasing or ridiculing Democrats for being tax and spenders. And of course, that's an old jibe. And ridicule is a very sharp tool in politics. And so I long ago actually came up with a counter slogan of tax and that could be applied towards that side, calling them tax and steal. And I think that this bailout that first went in under Bush, before he was out of office, where there weren't even any stipulations on it as to how they spend the money, and they're now refusing to explain how they spent the money, sort of underscores that was going on. You had mentioned that you definitely want to see this new bailout go through, or this new spending plan go through fast. I think there's a lot of concern out there that it's going through too fast without proper review.
Well, it's a legitimate question. I think when I was saying that about spending, I'm actually not a person who thinks we should spend all the time. My other book, The Conservative Nanny State, I'm actually arguing that we shouldn't be thinking of the government as being big spenders, because in some ways I think conservatives have a lot of good points there. This is an extraordinary time, though. I mean, so when I was saying that we want to spend money, I literally mean that. We want to spend money. So if we have an option A is spend $100 billion on this program, or we could spend $150 and hopefully accomplish more for the $150. I'd rather spend the $150. This is not the time where you try and do things as cheaply as possible. We literally want to spend money. We want to get it out in the economy. We want to employ people. Now, again, we want it to be as well spent as possible. So can we have better safeguards in there? We should try and have the best safeguards as possible. But at this point, we are losing jobs so rapidly. The idea that we're going to sit around and take, I don't know, 2 weeks even, but it could well be a month, 2 months. If you don't have a very pressing deadline that you're determined to stick to, well, the way Congress works, it's easy to just keep rolling and rolling and rolling. And we really need that money. I mean, I think it was really unfortunate that you couldn't even negotiate something with Bush that before he left office, he would give. There must have been something he would agree to. I don't know. I don't know what he's doing. I don't have personal contact with him, but presumably he'd have agreed to give some money to the states. They're Republican states too. So, so they don't have to start laying off people, cut back services. I mean, this is going on, and if we don't have money from Congress very quickly, as state and local governments, you're going to see another round of layoffs. I mean, we've already seen a lot here in D.C. and Virginia and Maryland, but it's all across the country. If we don't get money to those states real soon, they're going to be laying off people left and right. So I don't think we have the luxury of saying how can we make sure it's best spent. We really do have to spend it. So obviously, we should try as much as possible. And there are safeguards in there. If you read through the bill, I think they've done a pretty good job of trying to put in safeguards. There will be corruption. I mean, I'll guarantee you, you're spending $800 billion, you're going to find, the governor or mayor or someone who gave a contract to his brother, even though it costs twice as much. That's going to happen. But what we have to try and do is make sure that that happens as little as possible. And as I say, I think that's a small price to pay for keeping the economy going.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Baker. I'm from Japan, Taizo Nakanishi. My English is so terrible. Sorry, everyone.
It's better than my Japanese.
And I'd like to ask two questions. One is, can we manage the economy without a bubble for the future? And the second is, does the United States economy continue to dollar circulation from China or Japan or something like that?
Could you repeat the last part of that second question? Does it continue to?
Dollar circulation, imperial circulation. Circulation. Current.
We have a large current account deficit? Was that
Yes.
Okay. So can we have the first question about a bubble? I think we can restore a path of healthy growth. We just have to have different priorities, a different sort of structure. I mean, if we can get back to a situation where we have workers sharing in productivity growth, seeing wage gains in step with productivity growth, I think we can have healthy economic growth and not have bubbles. Again, we did that for a long period after World War II, 45, well into the 70s, before we had problems stemming from OPEC price increases, a number of other issues. But we had a long period of very healthy growth, no bubbles that were of any major consequence. So I think it is possible to get back there. Now, in terms of the United States and its current account deficit, no. I mean, I think this is a really big problem, and it's one of the things that was remarkable that you have all these people go over to the Washington Post, I call them Fox on 15th. They're absolutely obsessed with the budget deficit. I mean, it's just crazy. They're absolutely obsessed with the budget deficit. They write endless pieces on it day after day. The economy could be going through the floor, and they're going to be writing about the budget deficit. I mean, it's crazy. But when it comes to the trade deficit, which was always much larger, at least through the last decade, than the budget deficit, they had nothing to say about it. You'd find a story maybe buried somewhere in their business section. Their editorials didn't notice it. We had this huge trade deficit, which it played a very big role in the imbalances that led this door open for the housing bubble. So we probably can't sustain the trade deficit for much longer. I mean, a lot depends on what China's willing to do. They adopted this growth path that was very heavily dependent on exports to the United States. My guess is that they're going to be looking to a much more internal process that's much more dependent on internal development, domestic consumption. We'll have to see. But I really don't expect them to be willing to, in effect, lend us money at almost no return indefinitely into the future. So my guess is we're not going to have this pattern where we have this huge trade deficit much longer. And as a matter of policy, obviously the U.S. has some role in this. They act like we're totally at the mercy of these other countries. We're begging them, or we're going to cajole them, we're going to threaten them. We could set a price for the dollar just like they set a price for their currency. I mean, the yuan, I'd have to go look where it stands today, but let's say it's 6 to $1. If we think that that's undervalued, we could say, well, guess what? The Treasury will give you $1 for 4 yuan. We could do that. We could do that. And if you have a war that way, I can tell you, they lose. They end up paying an awful lot of money for dollars that they don't want. So ideally, you would never get there. You'd get negotiations, and you'd end up on some path of they raise the value of their currency. But I think it is very important to get our dollar down, get it more in line with where it should be, and that would allow our trade deficit to move to a sustainable level. We don't have to have balanced trade just like we don't have a balanced budget, but something close to that.
I agree with all your points tonight about the housing bubble and the need to shrink the financial sector. But I was wondering about oil prices and fuel prices, and do you think how big of a role do you think that played in this crisis? Because if you look at previous very rapid run-ups in fuel prices like OPEC 1 and OPEC 2, you find that they start to Granger cause, and if you run SFARs and things of that sort, you find that they have a big effect on industrial production. So do you think that was kind of the thing that started this whole thing kind of tumbling down, or what do you think of the role that fuel prices played in this crisis?
It's a real good question. I think you had, obviously, speculation in fuel that was the same sort of speculation that led to the housing bubble. I don't think it played a major role during the winter this year and spring when you had gas prices crossing $4 a gallon. Obviously, it was putting downward pressure on the economy, pulling money out of people's pocket. But I think at most that might have affected the timing because the collapse is already underway. Pulling money out of people's pocket at that point in time probably facilitated the collapse, and that was harder for people to make ends meet on their mortgages, so probably hastened the rate of foreclosure and defaults. But I don't think it was really central to the story. Everything that we saw happen would have happened even if we didn't have that spike in oil price. Excuse me.
I know you're a economist, not a psychiatrist, but what could Rubin and Greenspan have been thinking? How do they think this would have turned out?
That's a good question. It's very hard to imagine. I mean, you always wonder when someone's so completely off the mark like that. Thank you. Excuse me. When someone's so completely off the mark like that, in a way that I would say, not just in retrospect, but at the time, should have been evident how they could have missed it. The only thing, and this is obviously total speculation, I never even met Alan Greenspan. I guess I've been in a room with Robert Rubin a couple times, but I wouldn't claim to know him at all. That if you get basically everyone being sort of an acolyte, everyone's saying, well, you're such a brilliant person, you never really think about these things. You just keep repeating them. And with Rubin, I have this joke, which maybe my dream has finally come true. I've been in meetings several times around D.C., like with congressional staffers and other types, and we'll be discussing some issue, Social Security or the budget, and someone will go, well, what does Bob say about this? And of course, Rubin's not in the room. I mean, and everyone, someone will speak up. Well, I know that Rubin or Bob would say X, Y, and Z, and everyone gives that great respect. So I've always said that my goal in my work here, my time here in Washington, was to get Bob out of the room. And we may have done that. We may have done that. So, but I really can't tell you. How could he not see this? I really don't know. It's a good question. Maybe one of these days they'll be forthright and say what they were actually thinking about all this.
I'm happy to hear some pointed criticism of Alan Greenspan because it seems as though there's this inexplicable adulation for him in spite of a number of very aggressive decisions he's made and policies that he's stuck to. My question relates to that and speaks to your last point about the influence of the financial sector on public policy making. And there seems to be a well-established funnel of banking executives into the public sector. And I think that's had a heavy hand in leading to this crisis, and I don't see any signs of that changing. So I suppose, what do you think may lead to that change? I mean, has some of their errors, will that result in enough pressure being put on the system to correct that funnel to cut back on this undue influence? And what do you project for future financial policy making?
Well, first off, I'd absolutely agree. It is a serious problem. And again, speaking to where things stand with the Obama administration, I happen to see a list of Timothy Geithner's appointments as assistants, and it's just chock full of Wall Street people. And there is this idea that somehow they're in a privileged position to run the economy. And the attitudes are they're just amazing. Henry Paulson, of course, was a former head of Goldman Sachs, as was Robert Rubin before he came to Treasury, and then he left and went to Citibank. But Paulson, this is a front-page article in the New York Times, when he made the decision to rescue AIG, he had the current head of Goldman Sachs in the room. Now, the reason why that was so striking is AIG owed Goldman Sachs somewhere in the order of $20 billion. And obviously they didn't see anything improper about this, or they wouldn't have had it. And you just think of this. Imagine there's a court case. You're in small claims court and someone wrecked your car and you're suing them for $5,000 because you want them to pay for wrecking your car. And the judge is deciding on the case, and you're sitting in the room with the judge when the judge makes it. Well, everyone says that you weren't supposed to be there. Now, maybe the judge would make the exact same decision anyhow, but it looks bad. And in this case, it's not 5,000, it's 20 billion. But it didn't occur to them that there was something improper about that because, we're all such good people here. And again, maybe Paulson, I think he made the right decision, for the record. I think he made the right decision to rescue AG. But, and he may have made the same decision whether or not this guy's his friend or acquaintance or business partner. But it just stinks. And this idea that somehow you have these people in finance that are uniquely qualified to run the economy is very, very disturbing. Now, how do you change that? Well, we really have to go after them, and now is the time, because they've wrecked the economy. And it's just remarkable to me that these people have any standing. Again, beating up on my friend Robert Rubin, I think of, during the campaign, Obama didn't want to be seen near his former minister, Reverend Wright. That was pariah. You can't be near him, or Bill Ayers, because what the guy had done 40 years ago. Well, he shouldn't want to be seen anywhere near Robert Rubin either. And that should be people's view of the financial industry right now. Not that everyone there is a crook, but an awful lot of those people are. And they did a lot of things that wreaked real havoc on the economy and ruined people's lives. So the idea that they're somehow specially placed to be running the economy, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, are we going to be able to chase them out? It's a tough one. I mean, it's been striking me. I mean, my column, Beat the Press, is a column of media criticism. So I follow the reporting very, very closely. And one of the things I've been very pleased by is looking at some of the reporting, certainly the New York Times. I'll hold them up. I've trashed the New York Times many, many times, but I'll praise them here. They have a number of reporters who've written outstanding pieces reporting on sort of the wrong dealings of the major banks, Citibank, Goldman. They've really gotten into the nuts and bolts of this. I'd like to see a lot more of that, because I think people don't fully appreciate, they still don't fully appreciate how this was totally preventable. It was through people's greed, through a combination of greed and stupidity that we really got here, and people have every right in the world to be absolutely furious at these people.
So my question is, what does it mean that the U.S. government will be taking over, or is considering taking over, B of A and Citibank? What does that mean to us, and do you agree with that?
Well, I do agree with the government taking over the banks that are insolvent. I mean, basically the story that we had in TARP 1 was that you had institutions that are essentially insolvent. They're bankrupt, not to mince words. They're bankrupt. Okay, if we're just left to they said we should leave things to the market. If we left things to the market, we'd have a bankruptcy judge who would be deciding how Citigroup is run right now. Same probably with Bank of America and many of the other banks. We don't want to do that with banks, because banks have a unique position in the economy. We have all these deposits, short-term deposits. It would be very difficult to envision a bankruptcy judge overseeing a bank, or at least a major bank. We could probably do it with a minor one without difficulty. But for the major banks in our economy, that would be a very hard thing to do. So we have to keep them in operation. So the question is, do you just hand them taxpayer dollars, which has basically been what we've been doing to date, or do you say, no, you're bankrupt, we're going to take you over, we're going to get your books in order, and there's been talk about a bad bank. That makes a lot of sense. We actually did this in the 80s. It's not a radical concept. The Resolution Trust Corporation, we did this with the S&Ls in the 80s. We took over the bankrupt S&Ls. We took their bad assets, threw them over the Resolution Trust Corporation, sold them off, and got what money we could for them. And with the remaining S&Ls, we got their books in order, and we reorganized them, and we sold them off back to the private sector. I'm not anxious to see the government run the banks. I'd rather not take them over. But if the alternative is to tax people, I want to get Joe the plumber here. Hey, Joe, how do you feel about paying higher taxes so that Robert Rubin can continue to draw a high salary at Citibank? Is that what you want? Because that's what we're talking about. So I find that a very, very hard line to push. I mean, I really find it reprehensible about every different angle. So given that the banks, or at least a very large number of them, are bankrupt, I don't see an option but to have the government take them over, replace the management, get rid of the bad assets, and then resell them to the private sector. I really don't see a serious option to that.
Okay, I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight, and let's thank our speaker, Dean Baker, one more time tonight.
Thanks a lot.
Dean Baker is co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington,